Wednesday, April 6, 2022. And before I call the meeting to order, I'd like to say a few things about how we will conduct this meeting. We're getting used to doing it this way. I want to acknowledge COVID-19 has caused us to alter our meeting procedures, and the Metropolitan Council Chair has determined it is not practical or prudent to conduct in-person meetings due to the pandemic. The Metropolitan Council and its committees and advisory committees will conduct meetings in accordance with Minnesota Statute, Section 13D.021, and members will participate by telephone or other electronic means. The public is encouraged to monitor this meeting remotely via our website and YouTube. The public may also submit comments to public.info@metc.state.mn.us, and we will respond promptly. During this meeting, I will ask that council members utilize the wave or hand feature on the WebEx software to indicate that they would like to speak. I'll call on members in the order I see their virtual hand. Members who are using a phone connection only should speak up when I call for any other discussion on the item. I can't always see everybody, so if I miss you, please just hop on in. I ask that members again state their name when they're speaking to ensure members of the public can follow the discussion with ease. Because of the virtual nature of the meeting, we will call roll for both attendance and approval of the minutes. When we do so, Bridget will call the roll in alphabetical order. And if there are no questions, I will call the meeting to order by taking attendance by roll call to ensure that we have a quorum for the meeting. We've been advised that council members Barber, Fredson, and Wolf will be absent today. Given that information, Bridget, would you please call the roll?
Councilmember Champoux.
Here.
Cummings.
Here.
Gonzalez.
Here.
Johnson.
Here.
Lee.
Here.
Lilligren.
Here.
Lindstrom.
Here.
Muse.
Here.
Pacheco. Pacheco. Turner.
Here.
Bento.
Here.
Zarin. Zarin.
Thanks, Bridget.
The roll is complete.
Thank you. Next up is the approval of the agenda, and if there are no changes, additions, subtractions, or corrections, it is assumed to be approved. Does anybody have any changes they care to propose, or does it look okay? Seeing and hearing none, we'll move on to the approval of the minutes from March 2nd, 2022. Is there a motion to approve? Hearing none, Bridget, could you please call the roll?
Councilmember Chambliss.
Aye.
Cummings.
Aye.
Gonzalez.
Aye.
Johnson.
Aye.
Lee.
Aye.
Lilligren.
Aye.
Lindstrom. Turner.
Aye.
Bento.
Aye.
Zarin. Zarin.
I see him on the screen, but we're not hearing him.
You asking for Raymond?
Yes.
I just logged in. Sorry about the tardiness.
We're approving the minutes. If you approve,
Aye.
Bridget is taking, okay, good. Thank you. Okay, and with that, the minutes are approved. So moving on, we only have one information item today on the agenda. Angela Torres, the Senior Manager of Research, and Katelyn Champoux, Associate Planner, are going to be presenting the Comp Plan Composite, Equity in Planning. Welcome, Angela and Katelyn.
Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. It's good to be here with you again, talking about comprehensive plans. I'm Angela Torres, Manager of Local Planning Assistance, so not research, just to be clear, um, in the Community Development Division. I'm presenting with Katelyn Champoux, Associate Planner in Local Planning Assistance today about another analysis that we did as part of the Comp Plan Composite. So today we're sharing our takeaways from our review of equity as part of local comp plans. As we conclude with the Equity Composite, Mike Larson, Planning Analyst in Local Planning Assistance, will join us for discussion about equity as a regional value, which will be a great way to see how comp plans provide context for our future work. Next slide, please. As a visual reminder of the topic, this slide kind of serves to remind us of the core questions we ask in regional planning. Where are we today? That's what the composite reports have been covering. Where do we want to go and how do we want to get there? These questions help us answer what are the barriers or opportunities for achieving our vision. And today we're bringing additional reporting, as I mentioned, on the where are we today component. The intent is to view each component as a building block or a foundation for the upcoming work on the 2050 Regional Development Guide. It's hard to think about 2050, but here we are talking about it already. Today, we continue to report out on what we know from local comp plans, and the comp plans help us understand where communities are now so we can better understand what the region's challenges will be in 2050. Next slide, please. Next slide, please, Greg. I will just go ahead. There we go. Thank you so much. I appreciate that. We kicked off the Comp Plan Composite reports last April when we started sharing out headlines from all of the analysis that we had been doing on the plans that we had reviewed so far. We know that the local plans reflect regional policies, and we started the composite to share big picture overview describing how local plans were doing just that, reflecting regional policies. We saw that particularly related to the regional systems of transportation, water resources, and regional parks, but that it also includes land use, resilience, and natural resources, where the Council's policies provide direction to local planning efforts. We've shared additional analysis on elements related to public health, planning for aging, housing, and most recently, local visions and priorities, which are not required components of local plans, but we saw them showing up quite often. So now I'll turn it over to Katelyn to present the analysis on equity in comp plans, and I will come back to you later on in the presentation. Go ahead, Katelyn.
Go to the next slide. Thank you. Thanks, Angela, for the introduction. Good afternoon, Chair and committee members. As Angela mentioned, I'm Katelyn Champoux. I'm an associate planner in the Local Planning Assistance Unit. Today, I'll share findings from my research and analysis of equity in 2040 comprehensive plans. I'll start by providing some background information on the research, focusing on its purpose and methodology. I'll follow this with an overview of some trends and themes that emerged in the research findings, as well as highlight several standout communities. And finally, I'll close with a few next steps and some time for questions and discussion at the end. Next slide, please. So as you are all aware, equity is an outcome in Thrive, and it's already been identified as a key regional issue for the 2050 regional planning process. That said, the purpose of this work is to better understand and report on themes related to equity in comprehensive plans and to provide a baseline for how local governments plan to address equity over the next 2 decades. So we hope that this information will both help staff provide technical assistance to local governments when implementing their plans and inform ongoing regional planning conversations. With that in mind, there were 3 questions that guided this research. First, are local governments addressing equity in 2040 comprehensive plans? Second, which communities are addressing equity, and more specifically, which types of communities are addressing equity? So thinking about community designations. And third, how are communities talking about equity in their comprehensive plans? So in this study, 162 comprehensive plans submitted to the council for review were reviewed for explicit statements about equity. So this sample represents nearly all 168 plans that the council expects to receive during the comprehensive planning process. The review was completed using 6 search terms: equity, inequity, equitable, inequitable, equities, and inequities. And during the data collection process, plans were classified as one of 4 categories: none, minimal, moderate, or advanced, based on the extent to which they incorporate and address equity. And I'll provide some additional information on the criteria for each classification in a future slide. But I also want to note that the search terms were chosen to minimize subjectivity in the data collection process by specifically identifying explicit equity statements. However, they don't capture the full extent to which local governments address equity. So communities may address equity through goals, policies, or strategies that don't explicitly state equity, or they may engage in equity work that's not highlighted in the comprehensive plan. So that said, we want to use this presentation to showcase some of the equity work going on throughout the region, while also acknowledging that there's much more being done that isn't represented in the slides that you'll see today. Next slide, please. So to set the stage for this information, I wanted to share 5 general findings identified in the analysis. First, the research illustrates how efforts to address equity in comprehensive plans falls along a pretty broad spectrum, from a single standalone statement to full integration of equity across the entire plan. The data also shows that, especially among plans classified as moderate and advanced, there seems to be a shared understanding of equity issues in the region. Several of these plans acknowledge past injustices, existing and worsening racial and income disparities, and increasing racial and ethnic diversity of the region's residents. They often use these facts to open the conversation and demonstrate the need to address equity. Additionally, access and health emerged as themes in the data, which were often used to frame equity content in the comprehensive plan. And local governments also mirror one another in their approaches to addressing regional inequities, as indicated by recurring discussions of equity in parks, transportation, and housing elements. But despite this similarity, each jurisdiction tailors its approach to align with its specific needs based on historical context, existing conditions, and community vision. And finally, as you'll see in the following slides, plans of urban center and urban communities often include stronger equity content compared to other community designations. That said, there are several suburban and rural communities that are making great strides to address equity as well. And as I mentioned on the previous slide, these results may be a product of the methodology used in this research, given that it only focuses on those explicit equity statements. So the information doesn't capture more implicit approaches communities may use to address equity. Next slide, please. And as previously mentioned, during the data collection process, plans were classified as none, minimal, moderate, or advanced based on the extent to which they incorporate and address equity. So the table on this slide provides a brief overview of the criteria for each classification, which ranges from none, indicating that the plan did not use equity terms from the list referenced earlier in the presentation, to advanced, indicating that the plan uses equity terms across multiple plan elements and takes a more comprehensive and connected approach to addressing equity by integrating it throughout the plan. And some of these plans even state equity as a guiding principle. So of the 162 plans reviewed in this study, 54 were classified as none, 61 as minimal, 26 as moderate, and 21 as advanced. So in other words, approximately 2/3 of plans use equity terms to varying degrees. However, there's still a significant number of plans that either don't use equity terms or minimally use equity terms. Next slide, please. This graph shows the community designation breakdown of plans classified as minimal, moderate, and advanced. And given that there's quite a bit going on this graph, there are a few points I want to highlight. So first, approximately 1/3 of plans were classified as moderate or advanced, indicating more frequent and deliberate equity-related content. Of these plans, 20 state equity as a guiding principle, either of a single chapter or of the entire plan. And plans that do so may take a more comprehensive approach to incorporating equity by integrating it into all plan elements rather than kind of sporadically mentioning it throughout the plan. And this method also highlights the interdependencies between efforts to address inequities in seemingly distinct planning areas. Additionally, plans classified as advanced represent urban center, urban, suburban, and rural center communities, as well as several counties. And as I alluded to earlier in the presentation, more than half of the plans classified as advanced represent urban center or urban communities. I also wanted to point out that although it seems like there's no data for agricultural communities, many townships with agricultural community designations are captured in the Scott and Carver County plans. And as you can see from the graph, all 7 counties in the region use equity terms in their plans, and nearly all were classified as moderate or advanced. So agricultural communities are talking about equity, but they're doing so through the county plans. Next slide, please. So on this slide, I want to highlight 2 themes that emerged during the analysis of equity content in the comprehensive plans. Those are access and health. And access is a recurring topic that appears in nearly all planning areas, whether it be equitable access to parks, transportation, housing, or something else. The term access seems to provide a general framework for introducing equity goals, which plans often expand on with more specific policies and strategies. So for example, equitable access to parks and recreation is the most frequently mentioned equity goal across all plans in this study. And kind of given this broad goal, local governments intend to achieve this through strategies such as increasing distribution of parks throughout the community to allow more people to live in closer proximity to parks, enhancing connectivity to and between parks and recreation spaces, eliminating barriers to use and participation, most commonly citing financial, physical, and language barriers, and implementing design features and amenities that promote accessibility for all ages and abilities. Additionally, although less frequently mentioned compared to access, health also appears as a recurring topic in discussions of equity. Plans that connect equity and health often acknowledge the region's existing and worsening health outcome disparities by race, ethnicity, and income, using these facts to demonstrate a need to strive for health equity. And this goal may be accompanied by efforts to engage vulnerable populations in planning and decision-making processes, removing barriers to accessing health services, and implementing policies to encourage built and natural environments that allow for healthy lifestyle choices. And in general, these strategies are intended to really improve quality of life and promote community health and well-being. And finally, looking at the health theme more broadly, discussions of equity and health seem to indicate a desire to more regularly consider the impact of local decisions on public health, especially for populations disproportionately impacted by existing health disparities. Next slide, please. So as previously mentioned, the research revealed recurring discussions of equity in parks, transportation, and housing elements within comprehensive plans. So on this slide, I want to highlight a few themes that emerged in each of these planning areas. To start off, I mentioned some of the themes that emerged in parks elements on the previous slide about access, so I won't go over those again, but I do want to note the last bullet point in the parks list, which is changing and diverse needs. So this refers to plans that acknowledge the need to respond to changing preferences that result from demographic changes, thinking specifically about our region's aging population and the increasing racial and ethnic diversity of residents. So local governments strive to meet diverse needs within the community, with some stating an intent to conduct targeted engagement or other studies to better understand these needs and inform future parks planning and implementation. Within the transportation elements, multimodal transportation emerged as a common theme in discussions of equity, in which local governments state a desire to promote equity through transportation networks that provide access to biking, walking, and transit options, both to meet daily needs and to connect residents to opportunities. Health equity was another recurring topic in transportation-related equity content. Plans that mention health equity often connected it with opportunities to promote public and environmental health across the community by reducing transportation-related emissions that both mitigate climate change and improve air quality. And the last two transportation themes I want to highlight are accessibility and safety. So the theme of accessibility shows up in two contexts. The first focuses on developing transportation systems that are accessible to residents of all ages and abilities, with a few plans identifying strategies to improve mobility for seniors and folks with mobility challenges through ADA compliance or employing visual, tactile, and audible design elements. And the second way accessibility shows up is in references to using transportation networks to promote equitable outcomes by connecting people to housing, education, and economic opportunities, among others. Communities also state goals to promote transportation equity by improving safety within the transportation system through strategies such as prioritizing the most vulnerable users and implementing a Vision Zero approach to reduce injuries and fatalities. And finally, several themes emerged within discussions of equity in housing, and the first being housing affordability. So plans that mention housing affordability in this context often state goals to increase available affordable housing, both through preservation and new development, while also considering the distribution of affordable housing across the community to promote access and housing choice. Local governments also expressed a desire to diversify local housing supply through both new development and reinvestment in aging housing stocks to meet varied needs across the community's population. So this includes affordable life cycle housing options that allow folks to age in place or age in community, and smaller housing units to address the missing middle. And while not as common, some communities mention various local controls they may use to address equity in housing. So these include fair and equitable housing strategies, inclusionary housing policies, tenant protection ordinances, and racial equity evaluations of local housing practices, among others. Next slide, please. And in addition to themes of access and health, I want to highlight a few recurring topics that stood out during the data analysis process. So first, several plans state commitments to advance equity within local processes, often as a way to complement their other community-based initiatives. So these commitments cover a pretty broad range of actions, but a few include developing and implementing a local racial equity plan, establishing an advisory committee to address racial equity issues, or diversifying advisory committee membership to more accurately represent the community, building staff capacity through equity training or hiring full-time staff to lead equity initiatives, implementing strategies for more inclusive outreach and engagement with community members, and evaluating recruitment, hiring, and retention practices for those that may perpetuate inequities. And the messaging behind these actions usually emphasizes the belief that in order to affect change within the broader community, local governments must first address inequities internally. And then in addition to local equity commitments, autonomous, connected, and electric vehicles emerged as a key theme in transportation-related discussions of equity. So plans that address this topic often acknowledge the need to consider potential equity issues associated with an increased demand for these vehicles. So for example, several plans intend to promote equity in the deployment of these vehicles by addressing barriers to purchasing or accessing them, and considering the distribution of charging infrastructure throughout the community. And finally, another recurring topic in comprehensive plans was leveraging tools to support the development of data-driven equity initiatives and to track progress toward local equity goals. Some local governments commit to using equity toolkits to assess the impact of existing and proposed programs, policies, or procedures, and to inform decision-making, while others may plan to develop and implement specific evaluation criteria to ensure their investments advance equity goals. Communities may also research existing conditions and use that data to inform decision-making. For example, one community conducted an analysis to identify areas underserved by park facilities and used this information to prioritize local system investments. Next slide, please. There were many communities that stood out for their approach to equity in the comprehensive plans, but in the interest of time, I'm going to provide 4 brief examples, and these include Maplewood, Ramsey County, Osseo, and St. Louis Park. So that said, I'll begin with Maplewood. Maplewood uses 4 guiding principles: equity, resilience, health, and age friendliness, to highlight local values that influence multiple areas within its plan. These principles provide a framework for the policies and actions identified within each chapter, which are further emphasized using icons to indicate content that addresses the guiding principles. Maplewood also stood out for its description of the equity principle, in which it acknowledges that existing inequities are a product of systemic racism and states the city's intent to address obstacles and disparities that perpetuate inequities within the community. And finally, I want to point out that the city engaged a racial equity work group during the development of the comp plan to help ensure its plan advances racial equity by meeting the needs of marginalized populations and reducing disparities. Next slide, please. Ramsey County's plan was developed through 3 lenses: health in all policies, resiliency, and racial equity. The racial equity lens addresses the county's large racial disparities and the barriers these create to achieving countywide goals. The county mentions using several tools to support its equity work, including information from the council's Choice, Place, and Opportunity report and the county's racial equity toolkit, which helps apply a racial equity lens to the analysis of programs, policies, procedures, and capital planning. The plan emphasizes advancing equity in the county's park system through the development of new facilities and programs to better serve the growing cultural diversity of the county. And it also acknowledges that the current park system was designed for a majority dominant culture and states that community engagement, a racially representative staff, and equitable policies and processes are vital to all future planning efforts. Next slide, please. The city of Osseo takes an approach to equity that focuses on opportunities to improve public health. So the plan acknowledges that health results from environmental, social, and economic factors and integrates the social determinants of health through its 5 health themes, which includes a theme of social health and equity. Given the reality that some groups are disproportionately impacted by poor health outcomes, Osseo designed the social health and equity theme to help address barriers that contribute to inequities and to promote positive health outcomes for residents of all ages, races, incomes, and abilities. And it grounds its planning efforts in the belief that by planning for the most vulnerable groups, it can improve outcomes for everyone. We also have a local planning highlight that showcases the city of Osseo's work integrating public health into its comprehensive plan, which you can look at if you're interested in learning more. But I want to thank the city for working with us to create this article, as it serves as a great resource for providing technical assistance to other communities interested in using similar approaches in their planning practices. Next slide, please. And finally, the city of St. Louis Park identifies 5 strategic priorities for its long-range planning, which include the city's commitment to being a leader in racial equity and inclusion. And the 4 main objectives of this priority are creating pipelines and opportunities to city leadership roles for communities of color and Indigenous people, investing in small businesses and services owned by people of color and Indigenous people, expanding racial equity as an ongoing discussion within all areas of city business, and creating an awareness of the consequences and unintentional impacts of the city's work, and fostering an environment that really welcomes opportunities to learn and grow. And in addition to integrating racial equity throughout its plan as a strategic priority, St. Louis Park dedicates an entire chapter to its racial equity vision, which outlines the goals and strategies to help achieve that vision. These goals focus on breaking down barriers to opportunity, ensuring racial equity in city services, and building social capital through inclusive community engagement. St. Louis Park is also a good example of a local government that incorporated some of the internal equity commitments that I mentioned earlier in the presentation. So, for example, the city has had staff and council members complete racial equity training to understand the role of government in advancing equity, and it has also created full-time staff positions to lead racial equity work at the city. Additionally, we have another local planning highlight showcasing St. Louis Park's racial equity work, which provides more information for those interested. And again, I just want to thank the city for working with us to put together that resource and help make that information available to other communities in the region. So with that, I'll hand the presentation back over to Angela. Thank you.
Next slide, please. Thank you, Katelyn. Before I highlight some next steps, I do want to ask a couple of questions about the information in the presentation and ask you to provide insights from your communities. Do you have examples of communities in your district that are planning for or implementing equity initiatives, and how are they doing this? And what challenges do your communities face when addressing equity, and maybe how can the council provide support?
Anybody want to jump in on this one? Councilmember Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a great presentation. Good work on all of this. One of the things I would say, I'll use Plymouth because, you know, my own city. I think it's interesting how equity is being perceived perhaps by some in the public too, because Plymouth is one of the most quickly, at one point, I think we were the fastest growing community as far as diversity, and diversity in, you know, many ways. And so addressing equity, I think, is still a challenge to a degree when you're working with the public. And so I'm going to check in with my cities to see what they're doing and what populations they're trying to serve as, you know, we continue to diversify. So the only thing I just was curious, are you running into other communities that are looking to reduce inequities, but also having maybe a challenge in getting, you know, maybe some public support behind that, or understanding what that might mean depending on, you know, who is in the community and who is facing what types of challenges in the community? Because I know in Plymouth we have different folks moving in and just different cultural experiences. And so that's just, I think, one of the challenges that I've noticed trying to just jump into this pool, if there's, if that makes any sense.
Yes. Chair and
Yes.
okay, and committee member, thank you for mentioning that. We do see a really wide swath of how communities are tackling inequity or equity issues. Some don't see it as a planning issue, so we want to recognize that. It's also not required in comprehensive plans, which is what Katelyn talked about at the beginning. Like, this is not all encompassing of what communities are doing. I think what we see in different geographies is, say, for example, some of the older, more rural areas, they talk about equity through a planning for aging lens, which is completely appropriate to the population that they are serving at the moment, right? We see other communities like the city of Bloomington that are in transition. Different populations are growing and different needs and services are showing up with being requested within the cities, and they're changing and altering some of their practices and doing things much differently. And I'll actually give you a highlight. We're going to invite them to come and talk with you directly about that. So that we do see a wide variety of ways that communities are talking about it. The example that Katelyn provided about Osseo, for example, they don't necessarily talk about racial equity or disparities in a specific context like that, but public health includes all of their residents, includes all of their community members, and addressing that moves the equity dial forward as well. So there's a lot of different approaches that we're seeing across the region. I hope that answers your question.
Councilmember Vento.
If you could come back to me, Madam Chair, that would be good. I have a dog having a fit about the deer in the backyard.
All right, we'll come back to you. Councilmember Lilligren.
Thanks, Madam Chair, and thanks very, very much, Ms. Torres, Ms. Champoux, for the work and for the report. And I find it all kind of encouraging, and especially seeing the work that other communities are doing and how what individual to that community it is. And I appreciate what you just said, Angela, about how communities are focusing on that. And and I have kind of a comment, and then that leads into a question. And you ask about challenges, and I feel that, I'm in a lot of kind of equity conversations and equity planning, and one of the big challenges is just the scope of the issues that we're looking at, and we struggle with it all the time here on the council. What does that mean? How do we fix it? How do we measure it? And so, sort of one of the approaches just belonging to a community that happens to be on sort of the wrong end of a lot of inequity statistics and disparities, the Native community, and and trying to grapple with this idea of, do we look where the equities and the disparities are the greatest? And I think your Osseo example is a really good one. In health disparities, we're going to see certain demographics, older people, people of color, that are going to be overrepresented in the bad side of the disparity. And so that approach, in the Native community, we often talk about the peanut butter approach, or one of our leadership talks about it a lot, and where you just try to spread the peanut butter evenly over the piece of bread, and that's equitable. And of course, that isn't equitable. It's really focusing, I believe, where the disparities are the greatest, with health, income, education, etc. And so now I'm getting to my question, which goes back to the slide 10, that was about where equity shows up in those areas: parks, trails, transportation, housing. The ones I'm probably most familiar with are transportation and housing. But again, massive issues with well-documented disparities and inequities. And so I'm just wondering, especially in the housing, transport, or in all the areas, are we to a point yet, or is there any benefit to sort of picking bellwether statistics to follow? Does the demographic representation in unsheltered homelessness indicate more of the housing spectrum, or doesn't it? And I'm just pulling these examples out of my head. Does the fact that in Minneapolis anyway, more Native people die or are injured in collisions, either driving or pedestrians, is that a statistic that would be a bellwether to kind of the whole equity ecosystem within those areas? Or do those kinds of statistics exist? And is this an area that's kind of worth exploring, or has it been explored? Please.
Chair and committee member, thank you. I appreciate your thoughts and reflections, as well as your question. I'm not sure I have a specific answer for you. Is it about, are those kinds of data points available? Yes. Does the council do some of that analysis? And we have dashboards and analysis on disparities across the nation, as well as within our region. Yes, we do some of that work. We have other projects that analyze at the census tract level how communities are the same with other communities, and some of those similarities are about disparities and inequities. So we do have a lot of information around that, and some of our regional partners do as well. Center for Economic Inclusion, for example, we partner with them quite often, specifically around the regional economic framework and some of the work that we've done there. So we could pick out some of those pieces. I think that those are conversations that will be really helpful as we start talking, and Mike will be available later today to start talking about how we feed some of that into the 2050 Regional Development Guide. And what is it that we want our region to look like? And if we want our region to look like something, whatever that vision might be, how are disparities showing up in that? Are they growing or lessening? And how does equity play a part in our values and in our vision? So I think that that's a really good opportunity to really explore some of those things further.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Councilmember Vento, are you ready?
We'll see how far I get here. We've talked about this before, and it came up this morning in our climate work group conversation, and I want to raise the issue again because it does relate to many of the jurisdictions in my district, and that is these the smaller communities and townships where the equity, one of the pressing equity issues for them is poverty, period. And it isn't poverty that it necessarily is defined by ethnicity or race. In many of the cases, I would guess that those who are poor are primarily white, but it's a serious issue, and it shows up in a lot of different ways. Particularly during COVID, it showed up in terms of broadband access, childcare, ability to get in and see a doctor, how to keep a job and keep your family together, how to put food on the table, how to pay the rent or pay the house payment. And I would hope that as we continue this conversation, we keep that in mind, that while the predominance of inequities may feel as though they show up in the urban or inner ring suburban areas, they are very present in the townships and smaller communities, and we have to be addressing them, and we have to let those communities and their citizens know that we are partners in this with them. I at times am questioned as to whether or not our primary interest is in the bigger cities, and I assure them that it's not, but we need to do some more convincing. I also want to note that as we go forward, I think that a lot of this is going to require a lot of extra engagement for us. So there's more I want to say, but I kind of got lost in the barking earlier and I can't remember it all, but I'll come back if I need to.
We can come back to you. Do you care to comment on that, either Katelyn or Angela?
Chair, committee member, I appreciate your insights and your thoughts. You're right, it is a broad ranging issue, and talking about it in the context of individual communities, similar to what Councilmember Lilligren mentioned earlier, is really important. And there are equity issues in so many different areas. Income, education, home ownership, all kinds of places. So we do see where some of that intersects with some of our regional systems and where we might be able to convene conversations and have a broader conversation. But I appreciate your thoughts. Thank you, Councilmember Vento.
Councilmember Lindstrom.
Thanks, Madam Chair. Council members may be interested in what cities have formed equity plans. So I was going to mention some cities may mention equity in their comp plans, but they may mention it in other formal plans that they have as well, like climate action plans or specific equity plans that they have. And the cities that I'm aware of that have their own equity plans in our region include Bloomington, Edina, Golden Valley, Minneapolis, Roseville, and St. Anthony Village. And outside of our region, Northfield and Red Wing also have equity plans. The one I'm most impressed with, or the city that continues to impress me in my region, is Roseville. I mentioned they have their own equity plan, and they've impressed me because not only do they have a lot of community events on this topic, they've done a number of public safety reforms. They've gone through the GARE process. What really has impressed me is they've done a lot of data analysis themselves, and they've gone through department-wide or department-specific process mapping, they call it. So they look at like what that department does, and they put an equity lens, put all of those processes through an equity lens and see how they can improve. And then they report back. They have monthly reports to the city council on how they are doing on the action plan. So people are held accountable on equity as well. Thank you.
Thank you
you so much.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
Thank you. Actually, I'm just gonna follow up on the last comments by Councilmember Lindstrom. It's fine to have this language about equity in the comp plans and in other parts of the administrative processes of local government units. But I think the in addition to that, and even more important than having the language and the process, is to assess the effectiveness and to help those folks tasked with implementing these programs and approaches accountable for that. So I would like to have that part more explicitly stated as to it's fine if you have equity language in this process or that other process, but set some benchmarks so we can determine whether whatever you're doing is working, and also to hold folks accountable for implementing what the plan states. Kind of related to that is that even if you have the best possible plan in effect right now with great outcomes, this is a fluid and never-ending process. As far as the equity issues related to, let's say, immigrant communities, 30 years ago, we would be talking mostly about Somali folks coming over. Right now, we might be talking about Afghans or Ukrainians. 10 years from now, I have no idea who we'll be talking about, but it's going to be somebody different from the major groups that we have today. That's just to say that we need to continuously evaluate this, and whatever you have in writing right now in 2022, it's going to be obsolete in 2030 at the latest. So there has to be also an inbuilt process to continuously review this, whatever you're doing, in order to make sure it's working and addressing the changing nature of your communities in the future. But thank you.
Any other comments? I'd like to make a couple on the challenges. This was a great presentation, and I know that Mr. Larson's going to continue this conversation, but over the months of January and February, the Regional Council of Mayors sent out a survey and asked the various leaders a number of questions. They asked, are you or is your city engaged in any sort of organized race equity work? If so, how long have you been working on these issues? What motivated you to begin working on this? Was there an event that brought this up or a request from the community or staff? If your city is not engaged in equity work, why not? Is it a deliberate decision or an area of ongoing discussion or simply something that hasn't been considered yet? And the results are pretty interesting. And what's something you'd like to know more about in doing the work on equity? Some of the things that are mentioned here, sometimes more than once, lack of bandwidth for a smaller city. And of course, we hear that about most everything. It can be very challenging to for city staff and or lack of prioritization on the part of the council. I think one of the comments that I have heard in these meetings is that it is important to embed this work in the comprehensive plan, or because administrations and leadership changes, and sometimes the wind can blow a different direction, so that to continue the process, as Councilmember Gonzalez says, ongoing, and needs to be framed in a way that it doesn't get lost or forgotten or whatever, but in these changing times that we find ways for cities to continue to do this work as the circumstances change. Let's see what else is in here. How to start conversations and deepen knowledge both among the leadership of the cities and all of the residents of the city, but also demonstrating why this issue of equity in all of the areas, Katelyn, that you mentioned, why it is important to everyone and not just the underrepresented. And so how can that be better articulated in the cities that are doing this work? I think it clearly is, from your report and your statistics and so forth, there's great interest in doing this work and going deeper. And I think that the Met Council is positioned to be of great assistance to the cities who have started the work and those who haven't and don't even know where to begin. So this is great. Another one that came up is are cities looking at the difference between equity of outcome or the equity of opportunity? And what is that difference? And should that be, should those be different tracks or outcomes to put into their comp plans, or how do they fit in this conversation as well? And then navigating political headwinds. I think that, again, one of the issues that comes up repeatedly is continuing to talk and learn about the issue, and how to establish metrics for accountability or for analyzing success in the outcomes that they are hoping to achieve through all of this work. And again, going back just to the really basic thing, which we've certainly had conversation about in many of our committees and so forth, is the definition of equity. It means different things to different people. And again, Katelyn, in your report, which is just excellent, is how does that then manifest within the comp plans and what the cities are doing? And I think that some guidance on that can also be helpful. But somebody else, another comment was, how do we address this in our city without making the city look bad as they start the work, or as they move forward with the work? How do you address it without looking, putting the city in a negative light? So anyway, those were some of the things that I just pulled up from the survey that was done that I think were kind of interesting as far as what challenges are, but it's exciting to hear how many communities are already doing such in-depth work and positioning to do more in the future. So, and as to what Councilmember Vento said, and again, this comes up often, is we need to make sure that we're respecting the smaller communities as well as the larger communities, and how can we assist in both realms, because I think that's really important. And that is all I have to say on that. Councilmember Lindstrom, is your hand still up or is it a new up?
It's a new up.
Okay, you're on.
Great, thanks. I was pleased to hear that access to parks, equitable access to parks, is a common theme. And I was pleased to hear that because we have a grant program for equitable access to parks, as you recall. And we gave out around $2 million for this purpose to over 20 specific projects all across the region for equitable access for capital projects and for programming projects. And but keep in mind, we had nearly double that amount in requests for grants. So we had almost 4 million in requests. We gave out 2. This is a decision that the council made to dedicate some of our park bonds and interest earnings for this program. And so it's good for us to keep in mind that as these results show, there will be continued interest, rightfully so, on equitable access to parks, and we should redouble our efforts because these things cost money, right, to achieve. So we should continue that effort and redouble our efforts to help our communities make this a success.
Great point. Councilmember Sterner.
Well, thank you, Chair Cummings. Yeah, my point was kind of maybe a little bit follow up to Peter, but I was thinking this before. But part of these outcomes with equity should have healthier outcomes. I think the quality of life should go up, and we're looking at our walkability scores and access to good quality foods and parks and improving that. And one of our outcomes that we're looking for is quality of life and longevity and safety, that type of thing, if that's partially in what we're looking at for our outcomes.
Any other comments or questions on this? Otherwise, I'll turn it back to Ms. Torres, or is it moving on to Mr. Larson? I'll hand it back to you, Angela.
I have just one more thing I would like to say before I invite Mike to turn his camera on and take the helm. So we do have some next steps, particularly as we pivot to a focus on the 2050 Regional Development Guide. All the work we've been sharing with you provides community context for future discussions, which you'll see that shortly with Mike as he talks with us, as he joins us to talk about equity as a regional value and how that's part of the region's vision. I just want to introduce one other effort that was spurred from the work on the composite before we do that. As we worked through the analysis of the many elements in the plans, we compiled, we analyzed, we reported out on the various data points. We told the stories that we observed, but I began kind of thinking about how can we provide communities the opportunity to tell the story, their stories themselves. I wanted to remove the filter that often happens between engagement with communities and you all. So getting the stories directly to you by the communities themselves. So I'll be inviting communities to share their local planning stories themselves with you periodically this year. We'll start at the April 20th Committee of the Whole meeting by continuing the conversation around equity. I think that ties in really nicely with the conversation we've had today. I will be inviting the City of Belle Plaine and the City of Bloomington. They both provided really exceptional examples of integrating or centering equity in their comp plans. They do it in different ways. I've invited one more community, but I'm just working on confirmation there, so I don't want to commit them. So we're talking really with those communities about what was the driver of this work? How did you do things differently? How did you overcome barriers and initiate that conversation, which goes exactly to what some of you were bringing up as you were sharing your insights. So I want to kind of introduce that and really just ask what stories you might be interested in hearing, what suggestions you might have. I will we're starting with equity, but we're exploring communities doing innovative climate work or creating new housing initiatives, planning for the many transportation modes in newer, different ways. So if I want to ask you what stories you might be interested in, and if you have suggestions as to local planning stories you already know that are doing these really new and different innovative approaches.
Thank you for that. And this is really exciting. And I love the idea of hearing directly from the communities, because we often say, well, what did the communities think, or what did the communities say? And so that's wonderful. Councilmember Chambliss.
Thank you. I think this has been a really good discussion, and I'm glad that we really dug into some of the best practices with our participating cities and their comprehensive plans related to equity. In addition to going back to them and hearing additional stories, what are we doing besides gathering this research and information? How do we get this information out to the cities? I know in our community development meeting, there was a suggestion to attend a meeting with city leaders attending. This might be a great opportunity to share some of the findings. You don't necessarily have to highlight where folks haven't done so well, but we can certainly talk about areas where cities have gotten some really good ideas related to equity, and where the research shows there could be opportunities to improve it.
Thank you, Councilmember.
Chair and committee member, I'll just respond to the question about how are we getting this information out to communities on the good work that is doing. We do provide a lot of technical assistance around not only the areas of policy, areas of our system plans, but also other things that intersect with the comprehensive planning process. So that includes equity. We have done community engagement training with local governments, providing that free and with CM credits. We've provided different podcasts or webinars or events where we're talking specifically about some of these things. We have some implementation practices that we're working with. We partner with the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. They have a Resilient Communities project, and we fund projects that local governments are actually working to implement in their comp plan, and some of those are equity initiatives. We define resiliency really broadly. And so we're trying to do some of those things to partner with communities. We do some of the other standard things, going to conferences and doing highlights and doing presentations as well. But we're always happy to hear of other locations and places where you might think that we should show up as well, and we will do that.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. That makes me think also, Ms. Torres said, if you had a comprehensive list of sorts of different things that you just mentioned and ways that the council can be helpful to various communities, and get that to us, that we can get out through our various meetings with our own constituencies and our own cities and counties and so forth within our districts, that would be really, really helpful, because that having that comprehensive information available to pass out, because we all touch base with so many, and staff is doing a wonderful job, but I think that we can help you spread the word. And I know we do it through social media and so forth, but I think we can go directly as we meet with our cities and so forth. So that would be helpful as well.
That'd be great. Thank you. We'll take care of that.
Okay. Anybody else? Councilmember Champoux, is your hand still up or newly up?
No, I need to take it down. Thank you.
Okay. All right, I will hand it back to you, Ms. Torres.
Thank you so much. I'm actually going to turn it over to Mike now and ask Greg if he'll show the slide again, starting on, I think, slide 17, discussion for the regional vision.
Well, good afternoon, Chair Cummings and council members. It's good to see you again. I'll just wait till the slide is up. Okay, great. Again, I'm Michael Larson, planning analyst and local planning assistant in the community development division. Recently, a recent committee of the whole meeting, I previewed these particular questions for you as to how you might consider articulating the region's values and vision, part of the 2050 Regional Development Guide process. I wanted to piggyback on this discussion of equity composite from the comp plans to begin that discussion of how we might begin to articulate regional issues, in particular, in this case, regional equity. One of our most important regional issues. Obviously, it's a topic that is discussed often, either directly or indirectly. You just had a rich discussion, so some of my remarks may be a little bit redundant, so I appreciated hearing your reactions to the content and how cities approach that, and appreciate the engagement. So that alone is going to give me some ideas about how to proceed forward. As we've said before, our overall objective for the 2050 Regional Development Guide is to have equity as well as the other issues articulated explicitly and concisely in ways that are both meaningful and actionable through our policy plans and programs, both in direct ways as well as integrated throughout the various policy plans. This is an approach that we used for racial inclusion as one of the 9 strategic priorities in the regional economic framework. So we addressed racial inclusion. Our adopted regional economic framework addressed racial inclusion specifically, and it was intentionally integrated through the other 8 strategic priorities. And I think that experience is something that we might want to replicate, and we will be. Given that the regional economic framework was an intentional effort that occurred recently, I think it'll be an important source of source information for us as we address issues in particular related to the economy and the economic well-being of the region's residents. So I'd like to invite you to continue the conversation with an eye towards how we might articulate these things from a regional planning document. Thinking about what our values are as a region, what our vision is for the region in terms of equity, and what specific equitable outcomes might look like. And as I mentioned before, equity is framed as an outcome in Thrive MSP 2040, but it really can be articulated in different ways. And I think we want to be cognizant of that. Like I think one council member mentioned what equity means to different people. It depends on the context and the issue. So I do want to mention that in one of our initial points of engagement will be the Equity Advisory Committee. As I had mentioned previously, we'll be meeting with them on the 19th. And then we're meeting this Friday too with the co-chairs to plan that initial engagement. So I'm sorry I don't have a lot. This was a little bit last minute add on, so I don't have a series of really fun slides to look at, just the questions you see on the screen. So if you want to see a bigger version of me at some point, we could take this down. But I did want to kind of walk through these 3 high level things and then get some of your reactions. The first set of I'm sorry, Greg, I didn't mean to tell you to take it down just yet. I'm gonna kind of walk through those questions right now. So there you go, thank you. So the first set of questions relate to values, and I've got in my files references of dozens of words that represents values that kind of just use that as a sort of thought exercise. Sometimes we use principle as a synonym for values. We do, and we do articulate principles in the council's public engagement plan. It identifies 8 principles, and I think that's, again, we want to look to some of the ways that we already articulate these things. So of those 8, equity is specifically called out, and that's defined, but there are also 7 other principles, and those include 4 that I think are tied to values around equity. So other ways to articulate it and include respect, collaboration, inclusion, and cultural competence. So these are words that we may wish to mirror in the 2050 Regional Development Guide for consistency. If these words are still meaningful and they speak to what our values are, let's continue to use them, or that would be my suggestion anyway. So having said that, I do want to hear from you what words come to mind, what they mean to you, and why you might propose them. So I'm going to try to talk a little bit quickly here, and then we can circle back, or however you want to handle it. But in terms of the vision, the second set of questions relate to vision. If our values are put into practice, what would our region look like, or how people might experience it that's maybe different or better than it is today? And as we also think about our main policy areas, and clearly you were just a moment ago thinking about how it relates to transportation, parks, housing, water resources, that kind of thing. And in our recent presentation of themes that from your policymaker conversations and the conversations at the advisory groups, obviously, equity is often related to housing affordability and choice, transportation related accessibility. I think we just heard from Katelyn that public health is often cited in local plans, but also I would add that recent discussions, and I think what you've been talking about is feelings of safety, respect, and being part of a welcoming community. So I do want to hear today or ongoing throughout our engagement how your thoughts about how we might describe that future, as you imagine that future for our region. And then lastly, before I turn it back to you, we're looking at kind of high-level outcomes, broad goals about how we might describe the outcomes that would describe our vision for equity. And I think oftentimes we talk about reduction or elimination of racial wealth and income gaps. I know one council member just a bit ago, mentioned, how we might measure that. So another might be elimination of homelessness, so not directly related to racial inequities, but also, a significant issue for the well-being of a certain part of our population. Reduction or elimination of housing cost burden for low-income workers or fixed income, another dimension of equity. We might think about, from the positive side, we could look at increased housing choice and affordability. That's not a new thing, but something that we would re-articulate. Accessibility to job, services, recreation, other destinations by means other than a personal automobile. Related to inequities in terms of income, quality of life by people who have mobility challenges, that kind of thing. Some other ideas that have been articulated are feelings of belonging, either by people of color or immigrant groups. So a sense of their own community, as well as perhaps a sense of community at the regional level. Safety and security, often, and obviously this has been an issue in front of you on transit, but also something we've considered for regional parks, and then just throughout the region's various places where we might have a less direct impact. And you know, one other idea for your consideration that's something that's reflected in the regional economic framework is the region's reputation. Would we have a reputation as a supportive place for people of color to live, work, start families, or start or grow businesses? And that's an important economic issue that's articulated in our regional economic framework. So I'd like to hear from you if how those resonate for you, or how you might think a future would be represented as a quote unquote outcome. So I encourage you to offer things for our consideration as staff. You know, I've already got a long list from your prior conversation after Katelyn's presentation. But I look forward to hearing what you think. So that's all I have, and I'm happy to jump in and support the conversation. If you have follow-up questions for me, and look forward to any suggestions about how to frame these important issues. A large and complex issue that I think we spend some time thinking about how to articulate that. I hope that that is a helpful exercise for us going forward, like I said, and to reflect our values and reflect to be able to support plans that have clear connections to actions that address these issues for us. So I'll just leave it at there, and happy to hear what your other thoughts about that. Thank you.
Thank you. That was a great presentation as well. Are there any council comments, questions, answers to some of the questions that Mr. Larson has posed? And I can't see very many people with the slide up, so if I'm not seeing you and you have your hand up, jump in. I guess I would just throw out one of the questions: how should the language be organized and how much detail is needed? Words matter, and language is really, really important. And I think how we express the values and the visions and looking at the outcomes we want to achieve is going to be a challenge, just because it's very complex, and the use of language, as we have found in many things, can be challenging in many ways and in different ways. And I think one of the things too, Mike, that you mentioned and that we mentioned in the discussion before is that a word can have a different definition depending on the context. And so too much detail or too much definition can be off-putting or challenging, or maybe not open a door that we want to have opened, or maybe misinterpreted. So I think that that will be really, really an important thing to be thoughtful about. And I will say, however, with all of the issues that the Met Council deals with, staff is so cognizant of the weight that language carries and the importance of it, that I'm always impressed by how things are expressed and how much thought and has gone into expressing what we want to express, and yet doing it in a way that can be open to the interpretation in different contexts. So anyway, I sort of rambled on that one. My language was not so great on that one, but I hope you got the gist of what I was trying to say. Thank you for the thumbs up. Okay. Other comments on what Mr. Larson presented? Thoughts, ideas? Mr. Larson.
One of the things that I wanted to do is kind of test run this engagement with you all, and if you are all spent in terms of providing feedback, I certainly would be interested in knowing if what you might want to see next, or how you would want to see information. Perhaps it may be helpful for you to see draft statements that we propose and see if those resonate or capture the level of detail that we think might be appropriate.
Thoughts on that? Councilmember Lee, I see you popped on. Did you have something you wanted to throw out?
Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair. I was gonna say that I think Mike's suggestion is good, that if we see some draft language that we could add or subtract to, it would be helpful. And I think something in our vision should account for, I think in some way express that we want our cities to be strong and resilient, and resilient in all the ways, whether it's, being able to withstand the shocks of climate catastrophe and natural disasters, or political shocks, that whatever may come, that somehow all cities are ready and equipped to be resilient in that way that equalizes all of them.
Thank you. Other comments or thoughts? I'm not seeing any additional hands, but clearly with this presentation, Mike and Angela and Katelyn, it's of great interest to the council, and there's lots of thought and passion around it. So I think that the ongoing conversation around these questions, Councilmember Vento has her hand up. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Go ahead.
Oh, okay. If you want to finish your thought, you're welcome to it. I just wanted to throw something out. I recently attended a work session of the North St. Paul City Council. And during that work session, representatives of the League of Cities came to speak to the group and to also thank one of their council members, Councilmember Candy Peterson, for her active involvement in the league. And during their remarks, they talked about how they're going to be, believe that was at that meeting, that they're going to be having a presentation at their conference this summer by an organization called the Braver Angels. And while this may sound like I'm really out on another realm, and I apologize, but I think it's something for us to maybe get introduced to and know about, because if our cities and counties, I believe they've even done presentations with the state legislature or some parts of the state legislature. I think it offers us an opportunity to be a partner in that work. And basically what the Braver Angels is doing is they're working nationwide to help people of differing viewpoints or differing experiences communicate with each other. It can be at a policy level. It can be within an organization. It's pretty phenomenal. I participated, or tried to participate, in March in one of their introductory sessions. I was in the midst of some computer problems and it went from bad to worse that day. But I think it might be interesting, because sometimes some of what we're talking about here, and you mentioned this, Chair Cummings, was about how the importance of remembering that words matter. I think there's a great opportunity for us as well to be a part of that and to help further that along. And I think it has the potential to help us and help future councils with all sorts of work, but in particular our long-range planning and our ability to address and assess equity and equity growth. Just a suggestion.
And a great suggestion. Thank you for that.
Madam Chair, if folks are interested in knowing more about it, former State Representative Joanne Ward is a very active trainer with Braver Angels. She represented the east portion of Woodbury and southern Oakdale and southern Maplewood and Landfall. And I know she'd be happy to connect with anyone from the council on this. She's very enthusiastic and very persuasive.
Great, thank you for that. Mike, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I did. I was just going to mention that Braver Angels was the were participants at last month's Sensible Land Use Coalition talk webinar. So that was well received. So I think that may be a good resource.
Great. Thank you for that. Other comments, questions, thoughts, ideas? Okay. I'm not seeing any, but again, this has been just a great conversation and clearly of interest to the council, with lots of engagement and passion around what you're bringing up. So I hope that this will be the beginning of a conversation that is ongoing on a regular basis, and that we can continue to check in with the various cities and that we represent and get their input, their ideas, their feedback, and bring it up again and continue to fine tune and see where this goes. It's exciting work, it's important work, and there's already so much engagement that it can only continue to grow. And I think it's just really an exciting time, and this is our moment. So let's continue this conversation. And thank you, Angela and Katelyn and Mike. This was terrific.
Thank you so much, council members.
Thank you. You're welcome.
Does anyone else have anything? Otherwise, if I could channel Chair Zelli, if he was here, I would say you get about 35 minutes back in your day. So thank you all, and we'll see you again soon. This meeting is adjourned.
Great meeting.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks, Madam Chair.